Now we'll turn it over to Professor Dutkiewicz to talk about the NATO-Russia relationship.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the invitation. It's a privilege to be here today. Many in recent months asked whether NATO-Russia partnership can be at last a meaningful term. The pause in the enlargement process, the reactivation of the NATO-Russia Council, NRC, the US-Russia reset, the New START Accord, and the intensification of cooperation in Afghanistan have given some substantiation to these hopes. My point is different. My point that I would like to substantiate today is that those incremental changes, useful in many ways, are not sufficient and are not a long-term solid foundation for Russia-NATO cooperation. NATO is not a Russia enemy. That's what NATO says all the time. And Russia is not NATO enemy as well. But the relations are very ambiguous for the last almost 20 years. There is some cooperation. There is improvement of relation in the transport, particularly in sharing the airspace, and in Afghanistan, anti-terrorism, limited intelligence sharing, particularly during the last 2 years. But both parties seems to accept that the ambivalent relation, or this ambivalence, is the new paradigm of the NATO-Russia relations. And both sides, both NATO and Russia, to my amazement, are quite comfortable with these ambiguous relations. 24% of Russia defense experts that were polled in 2011 by the Atlantic Initiative, the study sponsored by NATO, said that NATO and Russia are neither friends nor enemies, and it can continue that way. The reasons are too obvious. The bottom line is that NATO does not fully trust Russia. And Russia doesn't trust NATO. That might continue for the reasons that are quite different in case of Russia and different reasons in case of NATO. But accumulatively, they are forming the backbone of the relations. There is a profound lack of trust. NATO is afraid of the Russian policy in the immediate neighborhood, on one side, and on the other side, Russia is still listing NATO as a danger in the most recent military doctrine from February 2011. But we can continue of those different reasons making this lack of trust even deeper than it was several years ago. But reasons do not matter if they are leading to the same behavior on both sides, which I will call the reinventing of the Cold War extra light relations. The refreshing part is that we discuss more and more openly those issues with the Russians. We not only emotionally feel that we don't trust them, but we now talking to them why we do not trust them. And in response, we have a fairly open and transparent responses from the Russia side, sometimes too transparent, as Dmitry Rogozin is a very expressive person from time to time. So it is a quite civil way, I believe, to abandon not necessarily illusions. This time is end of illusions about Russia-NATO relations, if there were any illusions on both sides anytime. The worrisome part, because now is a comfortable part. These ambivalent relations can continue forever almost. The worrisome part is that such ambivalence of the relations gives both sides plenty of space for their own external and domestic policies. We have seen it in Georgia in 2008, and most recently in Libya, which the Russians feel that NATO mission was extended to the point of violating the international law. With Syria and with tensions with Iran growing, I feel that we have quite a potential for a deeper rift between Russia and NATO in the next months. And my point is that we need new areas for the NATO-Russia interaction. Afghanistan, that was mentioned so many times today, is not such a ground for long-term cooperation. Any of those issues, transport, terrorism, anti-terrorism, intelligence sharing, and Afghanistan, are not the grounds for the long-term cooperation with Russia. In Afghanistan, entirely different goals. NATO would like to escape from Afghanistan as soon as possible, and it will be coming in 2014. Russia sees Afghanistan in a different way. What's left after? And what kind of stability or instability will be left after 2014, which will have a long-lasting impact on the Russians' close neighborhood, with the growing Islamist movements in Uzbekistan, in Tajikistan, with the growing trade of the narcotics. According to Russian Minister of Health, in 2010, that was 4 times more narcotics on the Russian market than before. All of those narcotics coming from Afghanistan, and so on and so forth. So Russia is afraid of the longer-term stability in the region rather than how to get out of this mess as soon as possible. Russia is a sort of the inescapable partner for NATO in many areas, but it's a very difficult partner. My main point that I'm developing today is that based on this mistrust and very ambivalent relations and looking for something that is long-lasting and stable, we are facing a very difficult decision. We means NATO countries are facing very difficult decision. It's related to the European missile defense, and Euro-MD as Russians are calling that. And this European missile defense issue is related to the larger issue of potentially very interesting concept of US, Russia, and US, EU, Russia, Euro-Atlantic security area, which this missile defense can be part of. Without dealing with this fundamental issue of the missile defense, my sense is that we cannot expect any improvement of the relations. My point is that the relations can be even, we can see the worsening of the relation in the short distance from now. Let me explain briefly in 4 points. First, despite the pass of time, and I feel quite comfortable talking about Russia, as I claim at least a minimal understanding of this country, Russia is still recovering in many ways from the geopolitical collapse of 1991. And against this collapse, against this backdrop, NATO looks like a very successful rival and a symbol for Russia's strategic defeat, and is seen that way despite the passage of time. by the same study of, that I quoted, 54% of the Russian defense analysts say that NATO is perceived as a threat because of the of being so successful. So, point is that we still live in the paradigm of the Cold War, the strategic balance and deterrent potential on both sides. And thus, any change in this balance creates a perception of the end of the balance and of something that Russia is profoundly cherished, the strategic stability that they have right now. If the missile defense will go ahead, means that this strategic stability is shaken, and Russia will have to respond, probably disproportionately to the potential threat. 59% of the Russian experts agreed that issue of missile defense in Europe is precondition for an improvement of the NATO-Russia relations, inevitably will re-emerge as Russian relation with the United States. So you see the different contexts as well. In the context of the US-Russia relations, not necessarily in the context of Russia-NATO relations. Recently, I had the privilege of having a meeting with Prime Minister Putin. 3.5 hours, about 30 of us, face-to-face discussed different issues until almost 1 o'clock in the morning, 1 week ago. And in the informal part of the conversation, I'm not sure how adequate I will quote him, but he asked, what is the problem with NATO? What is the problem with the NATO-Russia relation? His answer was, again, I will quote without authorization. He said, I told them means Obama and NATO leaders. I told them many times, and nobody listens to me, that MD is frightening Russia's strategic independence. If they will do that, we will respond. If they will do that, we will go even to the conflict with US. God forbid, God forbid. Quite emotional. Other experts which I met most recently are quite equally emotional. Because Russia sees NATO as a bit ungrateful or blind. Blind to the recent military reforms. 3 years of the military reforms brought about other things, inability of Russia to operate on the Western Front. Russia cannot attack the West in any way. Means Western Europe in any way, because they dismembered their capacity over the last 3 years. They moved some of the capacities somewhere else. They moved the capacities east. And they thought that NATO will be willing to acknowledge that. They simply disarmed themselves on the Western Front. And they feel that NATO not only did not acknowledge that as an advantage, but also even didn't mention that. So my next point is that moving from west to east and adjusting to the new security challenges, which for Russia are located in the east right now, not in the west. They are located in Central Euro-Asian region, in the Pacific region. In that sense, paradoxically, Russians and US interests coincide. They are not in conflict. They are more and more coinciding. Russia can be quite a meaningful partner for US, not in Europe, but in Central Asia and in Pacific region. what makes even, and that is my last point, what makes the discussion on missile defense even more tense is that Russians are very much aware of the asymmetry of the capacity. They know that the NATO and Americans have a big advantage in anti-missile defense systems. Russia has a very limited capacity as of today. They have the old ABM system, which is suicidal, means around Moscow is suicidal because it's based on the nuclear anti-missile capacity. They have a limited number of S-300 battalions around Moscow and somewhere in the east, and a very, very few S-400s. They are only rearming themselves. And they know that to reach the certain level of parity, they will need 4 to 5 years of the very, very extensive rearming. They have money for that. They allocated the money for that recently. In the next budget and in the following budget, there is a sharp increase in the military budget of Russia. But this situation that they are rearming is not within the confines of the traditional arm controls approach, because simply there is too much of the asymmetry to even start to discuss with the Americans that way. That we will limit our anti-missile if you will withdraw all this and that. That is not the point of even starting this discussion, because the asymmetry is too high. Therefore, we need something else. Therefore, we need what I was trying to say at the beginning, that the much more comprehensive conversation about the anti-ballistic missile defense in Europe, in which Russia may be part of. This conversation started in Lisbon, this conversation continued in Sochi, and each time they meet, they feel that the situation is more complicated, more complex, and goes to nowhere. This is worrisome. This is worrisome. To conclude this, one message presentation, in fact. After Lisbon, some hopes and some opening was done. After Sochi, the mood is a bit more gloomy. And Russia will reshuffle its leadership very soon in December and then in March with the new presidential elections. But this reshuffle doesn't change one thing, that Russia would like to keep the strategic balance, strategic deterrence system intact. And they see that the NATO is trying to switch this balance into the NATO's favor. And if we are not aware of this kind of the very deep sense of instability, we probably are missing the point in the future NATO-Russia relations. Thank you.
Okay, and now what we'll do is go to questions. If you can, please, can you go to one of the microphones, give your name plus organization if one exists, and please indicate to whom you are addressing your question. Sorry.
Hello, my name is Tural. I am from the Embassy of Azerbaijan in Ottawa. My question goes to Professor Piotr Dutkiewicz. I was wondering if there is any opportunity or any room for NATO to play a more active role in helping to address the problems that exist in South Caucasus. Like, given the fact that there are ambiguous or ambivalent relations between NATO and Russia, I was wondering if NATO can somehow work together or cooperate with Russians to try to address the problems. The specific of my question is that, like, there's aggression against Republic of Azerbaijan in South Caucasus, and in many instances we have heard NATO officials supporting the territorial integrity of Azerbaijan, but it's not going beyond the words, beyond the statements. So I was wondering if there any chance to talk Russians and to try to address the problem? Thank you.
Well, it's a difficult part. My sense is that not. My sense is that NATO is, at the moment, means I don't see a framework in which NATO can be engaged in the Caucasus. I don't see the reason why Russia will go with NATO on issues like territorial integrity of Azerbaijan. Russia launched a new initiative, and they would like to capture this issue within the new initiative of the Eurasian Council. If the Eurasian Council will go ahead as Medvedev and Putin would like to go, Azerbaijan will fall into the context of the Eurasian Council. And then Azerbaijan will say, well, no, we don't like to have it. We would like to be more close to NATO and to the West than fall into this category of reinvaded Soviet Union, yes. And therefore, it will create an additional barrier for NATO to go into this territory. So, unfortunately for you, as I have a lot of sympathy to your cause, I don't see any. Means NATO will sit and wait probably what will come out after the presidential elections with the idea of Eurasian Council, and to what extent the countries that will be invited to this council will support or not support its cause.
Next question, please.
Hi, this is a question directed towards Mr. Torres da Casa. I'm Tom Agard, I'm an intern with the ACC. I was wondering if you'd mind commenting on what you see the impact of Germany's refusal to participate in the Libyan mission is on the trend towards more formal European foreign policy cooperation and defense integration. Because for me, it wasn't a large surprise that there's still political differences about foreign policy within the EU. But I was more surprised by how the refusal of one country to participate when in sort of an integrated defense structure with more specific niche capabilities, kind of jeopardized the freedom of action for its nominal partner countries. In particular, in Libya, Germany's refusal meant that Europe didn't have a whole lot of organic suppression of enemy air defenses and electronic warfare aircraft. And I somewhat doubt that without heavy American involvement, France and Great Britain and some of the Nordic countries would have been able to act in the intervention the way they did. Thank you.
I think well, it's clear that, I mean, according to the voting in the Security Council, it was clear that there was some different views of opinion. I think, having said that, I mean, we can see the military intervention and how the member states, which of course are in their own right to agree or disagree, how some member states have fully supported and other ones maintain a bit more a different approach. I think this is to be fully respected in view of the autonomy and independence of each country. I would like to indicate, however, one thing, and this was, well, in the end has not been much developed, but there was indeed a joint action for, which was agreed in the Council for supporting the deployment of humanitarian support in Libya. I mean, if you go to the legal text, you will see that indeed there was an agreement for supporting that, and there was a European Union decision on that. In the end, there has not been much use of this joint action, but that indicates that even if in the front of the military aspect there was some views of opinion, fully respectable, then in other areas which are equally important and complementary to the previous, there has been an agreement on that. And I would like just to highlight that fine, there may be differences, but equally there are a number of issues which jointly there could be an agreement and there could be progress.
Question, yes.
My name is Georgi Ivanov, and I'm from Carleton. And my question is for Professor Dutkiewicz, in particular, the implication of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, of which Russia is part. How does that affect Russia-NATO relations? Thank you.
They're not related issues, in fact. Russia is trying to build its own security arrangements. They are quite fragile over there. There are many, many differences. As you well know, Russians are facing very, very big difficulty of advancing some of the agenda. Some of the countries like Kazakhstan, they are not cooperating quite well. They are guarding their own interests. Chinese are very, very good in putting the mines under the Russians' plans as well. So I don't see that this is that they are somehow linked. Maybe from NATO perspective, definitely not from the Russian perspective.
Then one there.
Hi, my name is Mike Middleton. I'm from Carleton University too. My question is for Kevin. There seems to be a strong desire among a bunch of the panelists to apply a lessons learned approach, or to pull ideas from, say, the Marshall Plan and apply them in Kosovo, to Afghanistan, to, we heard the ambassador talking about Libya. But at the same time, one of the early themes that's emerged is that every context is different and every case is different. And I was just wondering if you could speak to some of the difficulties of trying to apply lessons learned, say, from something like the tsunami that happened earlier to maybe Haiti, or, you know, in different theaters, say Kosovo and Afghanistan, and how you balance those two difficulties in trying to have a plan and a coherent framework for applying a template to something versus adapting to local concerns. Thanks.
Thank you. That's a good question. And they're different. So in fact, on the natural disaster humanitarian side, unlike on the conflict side, the government of Canada has a set of standard operating procedures, and it was in my talk, but I started cutting things out as I was approaching my 15 minutes. We do have a set of standard operating procedures, which have been around since 1999. Again, unlike with a conflict scenario, which is inherently more complex and quite frankly more political, natural disaster scenarios tend to be, although equally or more tragic perhaps, fairly straightforward. So you've got a Government of Canada set of standard operating procedures. As I said, they've been around since 1999, endorsed by the Privy Council, which puts foreign affairs sort of, responsible for the coordinating aspect. And when it happens, actually it happens, if you guys look in the room right next to you, that's where it happens. And at the end of, at the end of each large-scale natural disaster, there's built into those SOPs is an automatic default lessons learned exercise. So that happens after every scenario, and unfortunately, it's been happening very frequently. So, so the Canadian humanitarian response to the disaster in Haiti, which was largely well praised, probably was a lot better for us having gone through the tsunami and through the Pakistan floods and through a series of earthquakes and quite frankly far too many tragedies. Canada didn't respond in a large way in Japan, and you wouldn't have seen it, it's largely invisible, but there was a massive task force that was meeting here every single morning with Tokyo on the phone and covering 80 individuals around a table, covering more departments than probably most of us can name. So so on that side, it works very well. And again, it works well, though, I think because it's a little simpler. The conflict stuff is inherently more complex, involves more actors, because of the nature, because of the risk associated with it, the risk of, we talk about the loss of blood and treasure. It's just inherently more challenging in that neighborhood. But having said that, there's through NATO, through the Canadian military, through the government of Canada at large, we do go through an extensive set of lessons learned exercises. Actually, I'll be in the United Kingdom next week at the British Defence College for an ABCA event, and ABCA is the Britain, Canada, Australia / New Zealand Army grouping, and they're looking at taking largely the Afghanistan experience, but looking at sort of stabilization and stabilization results in a conflict environment. So get a bunch of folks together for 5 days and bash our heads and hopefully come out with some sort of common theme. So no shortage of lessons, and this is what I actually, not always lessons learned, right? Lessons identified is a different thing than lessons learned. But you take them, you take the best of them, you incorporate it into your processes to make yourself better the next time, but then you're always very mindful of what we've been discussing, that because each experience is going to be different, you can't say, well, you know what, the Kandahar PRT in 2009 seemed to be working fairly well, so if Libya says, hey, Canada, can you send some people, we'll just go set up a PRT there. I mean, you have to take that into, each result is very, very unique. On the natural disaster side, it tends to be a little bit easier because you're really working about a very short period, sort of the 30 to 60-day window. There's broad international principles that are established by international actors on how we respond, on the limit of our military engagement, on what we can do in our to use a military parlance, our arcs are a bit narrower, so it tends to be a bit more focused. So we do this, we're always doing it. It doesn't mean we're always getting it right, and this stuff is just so complex and so challenging that I don't know that anyone will ever get it right, but it does happen constantly, for sure.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, if you go with this one, I'm kind of. Do you want to make a comment?
Just to make a contribution to the last question and answer. Well, I do not have so much experience in Afghanistan, but I can contribute with my personal experience in the Western Balkans, and I have gone through the Kosovo crisis and then donors conferences, both for Kosovo and actually when the democracy arrived into Serbia, for the Serbia Donors Conference. Maybe one comment which I could make is that the involvement of the international community is necessary, there is no doubt, but first there needs to be some preparatory work, an excellent preparatory work which needs to be made. At that moment was called a needs assessment. It was done under the leadership of the World Bank or the UN, but there needs to be an excellent assessment of which is necessary. And once this is done, then the donor community intervenes. You need to understand what is available and who can contribute with whom. And then you need to identify priorities for the different members of the donor community. And this is quite tricky. I mean, because I mentioned before, we all are accountable. Our leaders are equally accountable, and therefore they would like to see the involvement of their country, which is visible and makes an impact, and it's reflected in the press, by the way. And therefore there is a number of actions on which everyone would like to be involved. And sometimes I think we have to refrain from that and be a bit more pragmatic, count with the country, with their own capacity. Sometimes it's not available, and then, okay, then we will have to find an alternate mechanism. But I think we need to start thinking a bit more about, and I know it's extremely difficult, politically extremely difficult, is to try to have a specialization. Okay, there are so many needs, there are so many donors, why not these donors focus on this type of things, and these donors focus on this other type of things? Thank you.
Bill Graham, Toronto. I have two questions, Professor Dutkiewicz. My first question to you is about ballistic missile defense and the Russians. I mean, this is a conversation that's been going on for a long time. When we were looking at doing ballistic missile defense in this country, I remember meeting with the Russian ambassador regularly. You know, we said, don't do it, it'll threaten our strategic deterrence, and therefore this is going to make the world more unstable. And the answer always was, that's totally ridiculous. Your strategic deterrence is X thousand ICBMs, and this thing can only stop one or two, or maybe not even stop any. I'm not convinced it'll ever work. But anyway, apart from that, so there seems to be a disconnect between the reality of what the program is and the Russian fears for it. It reminds me of when we were expanding NATO, and it didn't matter what you said to your Russian counterparts, they always said, well, you're expanding it against who? You must be expanding it against us. We said, well, no, it's not. It's just, we're just making ourselves a little more comfortable here. But it was a dialogue de sourds muettes. What is behind that? You must have said that to Mr. Putin if you were talking to him. He said, well, listen, with all these missiles you've got, are you really worried about one or two of these things? Or, I mean, is Is this serious, or is this just something that they use as a stone in one's shoe? So and then I'd like to just turn to Professor Torres La Casa to ask a question about another sort of misunderstanding or miscommunication, and that's about it's no longer called the ESDP, but it's called the European Security Force, which we talked about when we were at SHAPE. And I mean, they're still talking in NATO quarters about this thing being competitive with NATO, and it's gonna ruin Europe. I mean, the Brits, I was with a British minister the other night at dinner. It was, this is the craziest idea. It's gonna divert resources from, it's a French plot. It's de Gaulle all over again, capturing the military thing. And then when we got to SHAPE, we discovered, we saw what it was, and there was like about 13,000 civilians and about 4 military in the thing. So I don't know how it's gonna compete with NATO. But anyway, that seems to be a big perception. So we're talking about 2 big perception problems here. I'd be interested in the reflections of the professor about why the Russians are where they are, and from the ambassador is why there are Europeans who still believe that the European Defense Force is a competitive and anti-NATO instrument rather than a pro-NATO collaborative movement with NATO.
Can I? You're absolutely right by saying that something is disconnected here. But let me try to respond in a more elaborated way. First, if you perceive the threat, and if you have some evidence that you can change the rules of the game, even in a remote time, then you are becoming to worry because you don't know the future. Americans invited Russians. They have shown them those interceptors, A1A block interceptor, which is operational at the moment, okay, and they told them, look, this is so lousy that we cannot even shoot the Canadian goose from this interceptor, yes. And the Russians were saying, yes, we know, we already know what your capacity is better than you know, we already have it. It's not a problem. The problem is that you are talking about the 2B interceptor, yes, and 2C or 3C interceptor. So if we will install once these gimmicks, even if they are not as effective as you would like, in the next future, in the 2020, 30, or 40, you will have a clear strategic advantage over us. So this is not only the perception. This is the technological advancement which is disproportionately playing against the Russian capacity to develop new kinds of weapons. Not only to develop new kinds of weapons, it's to deliver the existing kinds of weapons. Russia has a pile of money, and they cannot spend this money because the military industry is not producing enough. And if producing something, the failure of the existing stuff that they are giving to the armed forces is ridiculously high. Sometimes they are afraid to shoot because maybe it will blow up, not in the place intended to blow up. So this is the problem right now. So this is not only the perception. This is the hard, pragmatic calculation. If you will have this on the ground, you will sophisticate this, and at certain point we will be not able to counter measure those. And then, if you will put Bill, please, in the larger context, the context is that what changed since the collapse of the Soviet Union in the paradigm of the Russia-NATO relations? Nothing has changed. Means still the deterrence is the doctrine of both sides. There is lack of trust, and there is profound lack, and there is profound miscommunication about what certain terms means still. Like, for instance, being in NATO. What does it mean? Different things from the Russia political culture perspective, it means different things from the NATO perspective. So they are basic things that are not yet solved. My point is that you can solve them somehow or bypass those by engaging Russia very strongly in something that will give them either assurance that the ballistic missile defense is shared to some extent. At least they are requiring the legal assurance that it will be not used against Russia. That's the Russian position at the moment. If we cannot join you, then at least give us the legal assurance. Obviously, no American administration will give such assurance to Russians. And that's the end of the conversation. And then the Russians will try to do something else. They will put some missiles in Kaliningrad. Poles will blow up because they will be afraid that this is against them and the Czechs and others. And it will continue to some extent, yes. So what begins with the perception from the Russian perspective has a lot of, it's transformed into the capacity reality in time. Skokovo, yes, they would like to use these new facilities to support the military research as well. But they know that they are behind certain things years. I'm not sure whether this is clarification.
Thank you. I don't think there is the thinking that there is a competition in between the European Union and NATO. I mean, the European Union has a vocation of being a global player. That's clear. I referred to that at the beginning. And the Lisbon Treaty has made a reference to that, including defense aspects. And as I said, there has been a progressive development of elements of that, including the European Defence Agency aiming to develop some capacity. But I don't think, having said that, I don't think there is this perception of conflict in between the two organizations, or that one day one organization could compete with the other one. I think this is also illustrated by the agreement which has been established in between the two organizations. And while I mentioned to that the 2003 agreement and the Berlin Plus arrangement, I mean, there are a number of capabilities which are necessary from NATO, and therefore they need to be called upon whenever there is the need to intervene. And this is like this. And I mean, planning, command, and assets and capabilities. So I will not agree. Maybe some people is concerned about that, but I don't think this is the case.
Yeah, there's one more question, I believe. Is it a quick question? Go ahead. See what it is. Go ahead.
Jason Fry from Carleton University with yet another question about Russia. In terms of the attitude toward the current situations in Syria and Iran, NATO member states and Russia have taken obviously divergent approaches. Given Russia's current vetoing of the resolution in regards to Syria and statement they will veto anything about Iran, what does Russia hope to get out of the current situation? What is their endgame toward the Iranian nuclear program or toward the current Syrian situation? Thank you.
Russia is a popular topic, yes. Sorry, guys. You should work in the Russia area, you will have more questions. Yeah, yes, or go to Moscow and become a specialist in Russia within one week, as many people do these days. To answer your question, Iran. Russia is afraid as West is about Iran having the nuclear capacity. The difference is between West and Russia is that the distance from Tehran to Moscow is much closer than from Tehran to Berlin, not even talking from Tehran to Washington. Tehran is in the close neighborhood, and the potential for destabilization of the region coming from Iran is great. So Russia takes very, very balanced approach towards Iran. They don't like to see them having a nuclear capacity, but at the same time they are helping them in many ways to build the nuclear capacity for peaceful ends. Russia was, to my knowledge, Russians were trying to negotiate with Ahmadinejad 4 years ago. It was the last year when Putin was a president, 2008. He went to Tehran and had a very, very direct conversation with Ahmadinejad, explaining him, look, this is in your interest not to develop your capacity beyond certain stage. If you would like to develop something to the stage, then you can have it quickly developed, do that. But there is a threshold. Beyond this, don't go. And the response was, mind your own business, goodbye. And then Russia influence, or Russia perceived influence over the Iran was over from that point on. Because it became the public knowledge, and then Russia lost its credibility as a mediator between West and Tehran. For Americans, they are much easier to go to Tehran right now directly than to use Russia as a middleman. So that's about first. In Syria, Russia is afraid what will be going on in Syria. They are afraid of what's going on in the Arab world. They had a well-established relations with Arab leaders. And they were quite comfortable with these relations. They were saying, well, maybe they are authoritarian, but they are secular. We know how to deal with them. With new guys, we simply do not know. We don't have the contacts. We don't understand them. It will take years before we'll develop the contacts, both political and economic contacts. We lost money in Libya, the Russians say, because they lost a lot of money, not in military contracts, but in civilian contracts. The same with Syria. They are not investing in Syria too much. You know, Russians are not delivering recently too much of the arms shipment to Syria, and they trade with Syria is almost negligent. They are simply afraid that if NATO will act in Syria the same way as in Libya, means it will be the destabilization of the whole region. They are simply excluding this possibility in their minds. And that's why Lavrov is saying, okay, if you have a Libyan opposition sponsored by the West, talk to the Libyan opposition and make them more responsible for their actions as well. And they we will bridge the gaps by putting them together to talk. That is the Russian position at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to thank the panel and for the split presentation, and it was very nice. And I think that they will be available for further questions outside, right? Okay, thank you. Now, good.
On behalf of the Atlantic Council of Canada, I would also like to thank our panelists, especially for being so flexible and resourceful in dealing with the time constraints. Thank you very much, and I hope that you will come and talk to us again in the future.
Well done, Wayne. Good show.
Thank you so much for stepping in.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, this concludes the morning session. Now, as you can see in the program, lunch is ready just outside the door there, and we would ask you to try and be prompt at 13:45 or 1:45 in non-military language, and we hope to see you back at that time. Thank you very much. Bye.